You all are the lucky ones. Yesterday was just okay.
No pressure.
So this is really when things start cooking. So feel good about that. No, yesterday was outstanding. It's rare that I come to a place and find myself tweeting constantly because of the nuggets that I'm pulling out, and I think all the sessions that I was in yesterday were fantastic. But what we're going to dive into today, right now, is this idea of collective impact in a bit more detail. And we have two amazing speakers on the topic who are going to help give us their perspectives on it, some of the lessons on it. We are going to delve a little bit into the role of higher ed specifically. We heard yet last night that might be a useful thing to get into. And then we're going to open it up at the very end for a few questions from you all. So would love for you all to be thinking about, what's been on your mind based on what you heard yesterday. These guys are so great that you could ask a question completely out in left field, and I feel quite confident that they will be able to answer it and inspire
toss it to
you.
Jeff.
Or toss it back to me. That'll work too. All right. So that's the flow of the session, and we'll get the morning kicked off right. So just to remind, I'm Jeff Edmondson, Managing Director of Strive Together, and who I have with me first is Melody Barnes. She was Obama's right-hand person as the director of the Domestic Policy Council, where the president entrusted her with strategic advice on a host of domestic policy issues, and that is incredibly impressive. She also has been on the Jon Stewart Show numerous times, and I personally think that is more impressive.
Right. It's actually what we all yearn to be someday when we grow up.
Exactly. So
but this is a good second.
Yeah, exactly.
You do what
Policy with the president, Jon Stewart. Okay. But more importantly right now, she is chair of the Aspen Forum and the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, where across the country they're working to support communities focused on what we used to call dropouts, we now call Opportunity Youth, to help make sure they are getting into the educational continuum and getting certification and degrees that will help them to thrive. And you're just coming off a convening of these communities all across the country, so you'll be full of stories. We also have Ben Hecht, who is president and CEO of Living Cities. Ben has an incredible background that you can read about in here. He has published numerous books. He is taught at the university level for over a decade. He has done a host of various social change initiatives. He is also the person who authored the foreword to this insanely incredible book.
And the rumor is that the forward is much better than the parts that Jeff and Nancy wrote, but that's just what I heard.
Morning.
Coffee. All right. So, but Ben was the initial investor in helping the Strive Partnership in Cincinnati actually uncover lessons very early on. They didn't invest in us early on to scale. They invested in a person to actually work with us day in and day out and capture learning. And that really was what led to what FSG ended up writing about in the Collective Impact article, quite frankly. They ended up showing up a couple years after Ben had already been investing in this, and they captured some great lessons in that amazing article that, once again, as I said yesterday, makes it sound like collective impact is easy when we all know it's very hard. So Melody, I'm going to start with you. And just, could you tell us a little bit about the work of the Aspen Forum, but also how then you would define collective impact now that you've been experiencing it through the work with all of these different communities?
Sure. And it is great to be here with you all this morning, and particular because I just flew in last night from the Aspen Institute campus in Colorado, where we gathered our 21 collective impact communities. So, excuse me, in a nutshell, we were building off of work that was started in the White House when the White House Council for Community Solutions identified collective impact as a smart strategy for social change based on its observation of communities around the country and understanding what communities were being successful in taking on big social challenges. And then they also did a specific focus, or I guess we also did a specific focus on opportunity youth, including changing the language from disconnected youth to opportunity youth. 16 to 24-year-olds are disconnected from education and employment with the hope of building out pathways for them from secondary, post-secondary, and into family-sustaining wage jobs and careers. The Aspen Forum focuses on collective impact as a strategy for change. The Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund specifically focuses on resources that we put into these 21 communities to help them with what are the most difficult aspects of funding for collective impact. So the backbone work as well as the data work, and we are providing them with $500,000 grants for which they have to get a one-to-one, there's a one-to-one local match that's required to build out these pathways. We started by looking across the country, talking to foundations, looking at Promise Neighborhoods, every place we could to cast the net broadly and identify communities that were doing this work. And then from there, we invited 36 communities to apply for, at that time, planning grants over a year ago. They did, we selected 21, and last month, we flipped 19 of those communities to implementation grants, and 2 of them have accelerator grants, which essentially means they're doing another year of deep work to try and build out their collaborative so that they can move to implementation grants. And I think, as you all probably discussed yesterday, and as anyone doing this work would tell you, this is really, really difficult. And we didn't just say, let's find the communities that are doing really well, and that way we can succeed everywhere. I mean, we consciously selected urban, rural, and tribal communities. They're at different points on the spectrum in terms of their work. And as you can imagine, in the diversity of those kinds of communities, finding the local support, their work with data, their understanding of what's happening in the community around them, even just identifying their opportunity youth populations in some places is very difficult. There are other communities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, other places that are much further ahead, but you compare those communities to Hopi, Arizona, to Greenville, Mississippi, that are also part of our collaborative, and there are different kinds of struggles. So I don't want to keep going on, but that's just a brief description. And from that, I would say that collective impact focuses on well-aligned, well-communicated, mutually reinforcing activities that are all racking up to a common and commonly understood goal. And the short term, in my head, in all honesty, is disciplined common sense. Because I think that collective impact makes a lot of sense at ground intuitively, but it's hard to do, and that's what we're all trying to focus on right now.
That is outstanding. So I'm pretty much just going to ask you questions the whole time since Ben took a pot shot at the book. So I just wanted to put that
And
out
she's
there.
way more articulate than me.
Yeah, I was going to say, absolutely. So, but I do want to follow up with one question. That would be the next question, and Ben, you'll get this likewise. But given that you've now kind of gone through a process of looking at 30 plus communities and then to 21, then to 19, what would you say are your insights of sort of the keys to success, even if they're on a different spectrum, from getting to just building to action? What would you say that just some of those insights might be? Sure.
Well, for one thing, I would say before the collaborative actually says we're ready to go on collective impact, it's like the prequel to a movie. What happened to Batman before Batman became Batman? And it is the community engagement work that is absolutely critical, and often people skip over that. And that's essential because it's a through line to who will be the backbone, a very, very important piece of work, and what are our goals? And we do this all in our personal relationships too. You think, like with your partner, your spouse, you're like, oh, okay, we understand each other, we know what we're doing. And then you dig a little deeper, you're like, you're thinking, what?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the same thing that happens in communities. People think that they're all working towards the same goal, but they're not. And that requires a lot of deep work on the front end. And as I said, the backbone, which is critical, and understanding what a backbone is and is not, and I think also the culture of data, and just literally building that culture of data, and I think we'll talk more about that as we go forward.
Absolutely, we'll get into that in a minute. So Ben, I should have said that you weren't only just the investor in the Strive Partnership and now Strive Together, the national movement, you also, through Living Cities, have run other initiatives like the Integration Initiative that have been founded in a lot of the principles of collective impact. So talk to us a little bit about your work and how you would define collective impact.
Great, thank you. So we are a 23-year-old collaboration of 22 of the world's leading foundations and financial institutions. So in many ways, over those 2+ decades, what we realize is it's hard as hell to work collaboratively. And you can work collaboratively and everyone say you're a partnership, and then you can work collaboratively and actually have impact. And so when I took over the collaborative 7 years ago, they basically said, we want our collective impact to be greater than the whole, to be greater than the sum of the parts. So we have Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, McKnight, MacArthur, Robert Wood Johnson, and we have the major financial institutions, Citi and Bank of America and MetLife and the like. And their senior executives sit on our board. So it's not like we have program officers who give us money and say, good luck. The whole idea is how do they actually use the power, the influence, their loans and their grants to be able to bring about systemic change. And what we learned over the years was essentially America is great at innovation, in social innovation. It's terrible at applying that social innovation to social change. And so this is Chad Wick's line, which I rarely attribute, except when we're in an education setting. But Chad said that innovation, who was one of the founders of KnowledgeWorks, that is the parent of Strive together. Chad said innovation sits on the periphery and doesn't make it to the mainstream, and that's the problem. And so what we've set out to do is say, okay, well, how are we going to get the change? Because generally speaking, philanthropy and society believes in the superhero theory of change, which is that one person's going to swoop in with the cape, and they're going to solve all the problems, and then everything will be fine. And basically, and as the great Sarah Palin said, how's that working for us, right? and the bottom line is it ain't working so good. And so what we have is we have an America that sits on a precipice that by 2040, we will be a majority non-white nation, right? No one argues with that. Right and left, they all agree that those facts are true. And under the current course that we're on, in part because of the work, the lack of leadership of the people in this room, I might add, we have a majority, that we will have a majority population under the current trajectory, a majority population that will be less educated than the current majority, right? Number one, that we will have a majority population that will have less income than the current majority. Number two, we will have a majority population that will be less wealthy than the current majority, which we know is how people end intergenerational poverty. And we will have a majority population that is significantly less free, meaning less democratic rights because of 30 years of mass incarceration. So we either stay on the happy course we're on, and we say, this is great, I'll be dead, and everybody else will deal with the crap we left our children, or we will say, we are going to set ourselves on a course to create a new practice that gets dramatically better results for low-income people faster. And so if you believe we're on that right course, stay that course. And if you don't, then you have to change your behavior. And so what we set out to do was, how do we find leaders that want to do that? And as Melody said, it's hard as hell, because they can often be very excited about it initially, but then when it gets hard, they're like, well, maybe we should just build 5 more units of housing or train 23 more people to be phlebotomists, when in fact we need 1.5 million jobs and 40 million units of affordable housing. So what we've set out to do is to find those leaders across sectors, public, private, philanthropic, nonprofit, who are willing to do what Melody said, which is agree on a big goal and say, this goal is where we know we need to go, and it's going to take us a while to get there, and there's certain strategies that we're going to undertake. And we're going to use kind of a lean method of saying we're going to build the strategies and the solutions, but we're going to learn quickly whether they work. Jeff's favorite phrase of failing forward. And then we're going to adapt, build, measure, learn. And we're going to say, you know what, if we had technical answers to these problems, we would all be using those technical answers. We have to figure out how to solve them differently. And so when I met Nancy on the shores of Lake Como, which is the forward, again, if you only have if you're limited time, in your busy life. So we were sitting there, and Nancy Zimpher laid out what they were doing in Cincinnati, which was they mapped out the 6 or 7 key things that were failing our kids from cradle to career, and they overlaid all the institutions, including you, who are along that line that are supposed to get dramatically better results faster, but aren't. And then they agreed on the results. So we said, well, I wonder if there's something here beyond Cincinnati, which, is people like to work together. Cincinnati, Twin Cities, Portland, Oregon, that is like the outliers of the United States of America. Everywhere else is like New York. Everybody has the best idea. They don't want to work together. They know better. And so we launched a now 9-city initiative called the Integration Initiative, which is not about education. It's about jobs. It's about connecting people to opportunity. It's about job creation, workforce. And we also had our portfolio of work with you. And then we're working in 9 cities with the Boston Fed, in small cities in Massachusetts, again, with this outcome focus, which is not about outputs, but about can the leaders come together and actually bring about large-scale change. And so generally speaking, I think very much what Melody said. One, you have to get the leaders together to agree on some ambitious goal. You actually have to use the data to say where you are now compared to where you want to go. I think one of the hardest parts is people don't want to actually articulate a goal because then they maybe won't get there or get reelected or keep their job. The other part is you don't have the leadership that's there long enough. So, the average university president, 3 to 5 years, something like that. Average mayor, 4 to 8 years. And these are problems that we screwed up over 100 years, not over 4 to 8 years. And so you need the resilience of the table. The key is not about getting new grant money to do new programs, but to move from being program rich to being, and acknowledging that you're actually systems poor. And so it's about a systemic approach to change that ultimately is about redirecting the billions of dollars that are currently being spent that aren't getting the results that we want.
So I'm going to attribute a quote to you now that you said the other day. We had a call with Jim Shelton, a webinar for folks across the country on what quality collective impact is all about. And you had a quote in there that was by far and away the most tweeted, which was, process is the new program. And it seemed to me like that was an insight that you drew out. Can you dig into that a little bit? What did you mean by process is the new program?
Yeah, so I think, generally speaking, people who have money or give money want all their money to go to program. So this whole thing, I ran nonprofits for almost 30 years, and everybody's like, well, we don't pay for overhead.
You are really old, by the way.
No, I know, I know.
It's just...
Well, especially compared to you, it's like you've condensed success in such a short period of time. I had to pull it over 30 years. Right. But the what we've realized actually is that when people come together, and this gets to the backbone that Melody talked about, when people come together and say they want to work collaboratively, they do that as long as they're sitting at the same table. But when they leave, they go back to doing work the same way. It's just a natural instinct. We all do that. And it's like with relationships, I'm going to change, and then you leave the fight, and then you're the same way you always were. And so what we've learned is that someone has to get up every morning, and they have to say, my job is to glue these people together and make sure that the goal that they're seeking, actually someone is worried about whether they're meeting that goal. And we learned about it. What's so fun about this collaborative that we have is that our board learned that. Like when I was hired in 2007, they had been a collaborative for 20-some years, or 15 years, without a staff.
Yep.
And so they were all about, well, we're going to raise our money, we're going to put it into a pool, and we're going to put it out without any overhead. And then what they realized was between the times that they raised the money and put it out, nothing got done.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if you want to have impact, someone actually has to help you to do that.
Yep.
And so the idea that if you want large-scale results, you're going to have to pay for somebody to facilitate the process of people working together in new ways.
Great. So when we get to the section in a little bit on the role of higher ed, want to dig into that a little more. Is there a role for higher ed potentially in that? But Melanie, I guess you were just at this convening. I'm guessing you heard a lot of stories, and I think what people struggle with is, can people really change, right? I know that my wife would say absolutely not, based on her experience with me. She would say it's impossible. But I'm wondering if you've heard any concrete stories of the way that you've heard partners, individual partners, or communities beginning to approach the work with Opportunity Youth or any other population differently, where you've seen that mindset shift actually happen. Do you have any examples?
Absolutely, but it's also slow work.
Yeah.
And too often and God knows, I worked in Congress 13 years, I've when DC administration, people say we're going to do something on Wednesday and they want to see a result by Monday. And we have to break out of that. You know, as funders, as actors in a collective impact collaborative, we have to get out of that for the very reasons Ben said. You know, I would say 400 years of messing things up will not be solved in a week. But that being said, we absolutely see that, and I think the learning communities that we are building serve as places where that information can be shared and people can come together and spark off of one another. So for example, last year, I think of several examples. Last year, one of the communities that came to the table was from one of our communities is rural Maine. And they got there and they brought their collaborative there, and it consisted of a member of the state legislature. It also consisted of a young woman who falls under the category of opportunity youth. And they had started to focus on issues of connecting foster care, those who are in foster care, to the post-secondary system. And as we know, the numbers, the stats around foster care are horrible, 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 horrible. Everything from teen pregnancy to healthcare to education, horrible. And we also know that too often we set tables, and whether or not it's with the community writ large, or in our instance, because we're focusing on opportunity youth, where we say, we want to fix this problem, and I know you are the person that we're trying to help, but we're not going to talk to you. And we're going to go over here and we're going to fix it, and won't it be great for you? So one, the idea of this collaborative coming together, and with this, the young people who were not only there to talk about and tell their stories, but also to understand and appreciate their leadership in this work, because they are the experts of their lives. They understand it in ways that we will not. And through the conversation that actually took place in Aspen last year, and I think this was one of the heads of the leaders of the House, the State House in Maine, started talking to this young woman and understanding the challenges in the foster care system, and the access to resources so that post-secondary education could continue. And in a way, in the same way we've done with healthcare and kids being able to stay on until they're 26, ultimately, I'll fast forward, through their conversation, led to legislation that allows for foster care resources for kids who are starting to age out of the system. So if they're continuing in some kind of workforce training program or going on to get their post-secondary education, they can still have access to those resources. And I would say the change that took place there was, one, a member of policy, an elected official, paying attention to and listening to the young people in his community and starting to work with them and drafting this legislation. Young people testified before the legislature, but it wasn't just the dog and pony show that we've often seen, and I say that as a former congressional staffer where you're always looking for the best story, but in an intense, behind-the-scenes way that ultimately led to the passage of this legislation. So there was the policy change, but also the change in the way that the community started to work together and who was sitting at the table.
Could I touch on something that Melody said? Because I think this idea of co-creation is actually an idea that young people completely get. Right? They just like they're doing that all day long on their social networks and the like. And it's such a conflict between the grown-ups who think they're experts. And they're experts in a very broken system, right? And
help create the system.
And they created it, and they're like, well, no, I'll figure out the answer. And actually, this co-creation, not only do you get better ideas, but you actually, they're going to be tailored to the folks you're actually trying to help.
Right.
And it's their culture. And I just think that's one of these, maybe it's a generation gap, I don't know, but I do think they look to solve things in a co-creative way. And even the classroom now is structured in a way where kids work together, they understand the value of it, but we still don't actually solve problems that way.
Right, and owning their own education, owning their own process. And we also always talk about, to your point, how do we nurture the next generation of leaders? This is how. It's actually sitting at the table, learning and listening and working with them. In our case, as we're building out these pathways.
So I was at the talent dividend announcement yesterday, which I wasn't here for day one, and it was interesting. Carol Coletta from the Knight Foundation.
For not being here for day one. By the way.
I did hand out the book though.
Oh, you did? This awesome
and
book?
I gave it away free, so you got to give me that.
Oh, okay, that's good.
And What was interesting, Carol Coletta from the Knight Foundation had this quote that I tweeted I thought was great, which was, engagement is the new leadership. And I think it's right. It's like engaging people at any age, but definitely at that age, is how you're developing the future leaders. And now we have the tools to do it, and we're acting like we don't.
Right.
Well, it's interesting because yesterday in one of the breakout sessions I was in, we had a discussion about, what does it mean to get buy-in? And do you bring a vision and then ask people to just come along with it, or do you have a whiteboard and just start from scratch? I guess what that raised for me was kind of maybe we're not thinking about the middle ground, right? That there are new ways of thinking completely about how to make this happen. But my question would be, I've heard in communities across the country that people are spinning a little bit. They get started with collective impact, people start co-creating maybe eventually. They get to that, and then they can't get to action. They can't get to this real impact on the ground. And I think the policy change that you talked about is a huge win. I mean, that's amazing. But have you seen folks that are really changing the behavior in what they do every single day with the population they're trying to serve? Do you have any examples of that?
So let me give this example. I don't know if it's right on point, but it's one that I find so powerful. So one of the places that we've been working in our integration initiative, which is integrating people, place, and opportunity, loans, grants, flexible capital, all types of leaders. And the idea there is they were about to spend billions of dollars connecting Minneapolis and St. Paul through a light rail, and they were going to go through the lowest income neighborhoods in the two cities. And the last time billions of dollars were spent on transportation, it was to build roads and bridges, and they destroyed the communities. And so you're coming in 40 years later with a fair amount of skepticism. You're right about the 400 years. It's a good point. But this was, for transportation was only the latest. In that. And so they said, the leaders there said, okay, we are not going to do the same thing. We're going to make sure that when we spend these billions, there's going to be benefits beyond the rail. And we're going to intentionally figure out what those benefits should be, whether it's affordable housing, siting of community colleges, grocery stores, whatever you want to see, job centers. And so they set out 4 years ago to kind of set that in place. And the table that they set to do that were all the leaders, from the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the head of the planning council, the major philanthropy, the nonprofit organizations, and the like. And every month they met for 4 years. We paid for them to meet, right? We paid for the process and other things. But that was one of the main things we paid for. And they met every month. And every month they set this rule. The leaders, right, the mayor and all these folks, they said every month we're going to go around the table and everyone's going to explain how their organization changed since last month to achieve this goal. And I was like, really? I went to see that, and they really did it. And I felt like I'm someone in a kindergarten, But it was a powerful accountability mechanism. And at the end of 4 years, you can look at every one of those institutions, public and private, philanthropic. So you had philanthropy now making loans, and they had never made loans. You had a government entity actually creating a whole office that was going to deal with equity every time they did any kind of transit thing. I mean, all kinds of things, all because they simply held themselves accountable towards that goal.
Wow.
And I would add, when I think about the philanthropic community and the way they go about doing their work, and like you, our funders sit at the table with us. They're part of our leadership council, so we're doing this work together. So there isn't the, how you dress it up and make it pretty when you see your funders once a year, and then you go back to, the craziness that sits behind the curtain. But they're with us trying to solve these problems. But we've also started to bring together funders from around the country, saying if it's collective impact, if this is our way forward, and we're also thinking place-based, the way you do work has to change too. And they say the way we do work has to change. So the 1 year grant isn't going to cut it when you've got a long-term problem and it's going to take a while to try and address it. So I think philanthropy is also starting to change, thinking about how they fund, the life cycle of their funds, thinking about who they hire, and their connection to community and their ability to understand the collective impact strategy. And we are planning to do a series of convenings with them because they said there are tough questions that we also have to take on. So I would say that's another example of the kind of change that's taking place.
Great. So we are here at a outstanding convening that is really focused on the role of higher ed, right? Specifically in this work. So yesterday, on another panel, the question was raised, what could be the role of higher ed in this work? And the superintendent of Albany Public Schools, Dr. V, as she is called, she said something pretty darn provocative. And it gets a little bit to your funding question. She said that if somebody from higher ed comes in and wants to do a grant or do research with students in my district, I won't let them do it unless they can convince me that it's part of the goals we are trying to achieve through our Cradle to Career partnership. I am no longer letting our kids, as she said, be guinea pigs for research. It has to be work that leads to an outcome. So using that little story about the shift in thinking of a community partner around their relationship with higher ed, when you think about this work of collective impact in communities, what would you say the roles for higher ed could be, and maybe what are some of the challenges that you've seen higher ed have to deal with? Is there anything that has stuck out for you in that?
God, there's so much. One, particularly given the focus that we have, the pathway, higher ed is a critical part of the pathway that we're building. So we're talking about either students who have dropped out of high school that we are trying to then reconnect and get into post-secondary, those who have finished or have a GED but are not connected, and we have to get them in, not only into but through post-secondary, which we define broadly. So that's a certificate program, 2-year or 4-year credential. So we have to have higher ed at the table. And one. And two, higher ed, I think, is essential if we're going to think about scale. And if we're going to think about delivery systems and making the systemic change and moving out of, oh, we've got a great program in Cleveland, we've got a great program in Kansas City, to how are we going to help the 6.7 million, which I think is an undercount of the opportunity youth that we're talking about. I think part of the challenge is that, one, higher education is trying to figure out, I mean, you all know better than I, trying to figure out what higher education, who higher education is and what role they play. And in particular, as we have more and more conversations about skills development, as we talk about job preparation, and I say this sitting here with a history degree that I love and a liberal arts education I love, and I believe liberal arts education is critical, but also getting out of this binary debate that we're having about higher education to understanding what kinds of higher education actors, the role that higher education actors can play for a whole range of students. And everything doesn't have to, every institution doesn't have to suit every student, but we do have to think broadly about the students that we're developing and the skill sets that they have. And I also say this as someone who's a vice provost for global student leadership at NYU, just down the road. And some of the skills that we're thinking about for our students at NYU are the same kinds of skills that we have to develop broadly across this population. And in particular, as we hear people saying, kids are coming out, and let's not even talk about, the kind of technical, do they have competencies in their fields, but also, and I hate this term, but I'll use it, the soft skills, because they aren't soft. They're difficult.
They're what people hire for.
Exactly, and what they fire for. So the range of skills that are going to be developed. So there are whole range of ways that I think higher education is important and critical to the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I'm with Melly. It's like, woof, there's so many ways. So I worked at Georgetown Law School for a decade. And I was in charge, by 2 different presidents, I was in charge of creating these community outreach partnerships, for those of you in the audience who are as old as I am. And it was fascinating because I saw I got such a good insight into university, which I think is universal, which is basically universities are not places of great innovation, number one. They may be good about research innovation, but generally not innovative places. They're very staid. Number two, I was leading this, what is Georgetown doing in the community? And the president, as President O'Donovan at the time, he's like, okay, go talk to the president of the campus senate, right? And so and tell them what we're doing. And I'm like, you want me to? Yes, go do that. And so I go do it, and I walk in the room, and he was a chemistry professor, and he was the head of the campus senate, and I told him what we were doing. He goes, are you done, son? I said, yes, I'm done. He goes, let me be clear, I see no role for the university beyond the walls of the university. We are about educating the students who are here and researching for the future of humanity. All right? Have you ever heard that? So I'd say that's an obstacle. And so I went back to the president, just to finish the story. Sorry, Jeff. But I go back to the president, and I said, well, I met with the president of the campus senate, and he was sitting there he had his little collar on. This is when we had a Jesuit president. And he said, how'd it go? And I said, really not well. And I told him the story, and he laughed. He goes, good, that's why you went instead of me. So that's a big barrier. And I think, so you're not going to move the entire university to this, right? But the question is, are you going to lead the university? And I don't care if you're a student, I don't care if you're a professor, I don't care if you're a dean or the chancellor. Are you going to lead the university to play a role in this? I think that's number one. So I think you have to decide, am I going to be a leader in this, in my community's effort to do this? I'm going to sit at the table with everybody else, and I'm going to take my hits. Right? And I'm going to realize I'm as much a part of the problem as a solution. I think there's no substitute for leadership, and nobody needs any more authority than they already have for people in this room. The second thing is, fundamentally, you have to say, okay, well, what are we good at? Right? And what could we bring to this? And so if you're really good at data, and you're really good at data computation and interpretation and all that kind of stuff, then just do that. Bring your point of view as a leader and bring your skills, whatever they are. I just pick on the data. But I do believe that, and the other thing is there's something about humility that's not really, there's not a lot of that in the room. I don't know any of you, but I do, right? And I think humility goes a long way, because basically, and I say this all the time, I've been in social change for 30 years, and I see poverty getting worse, not better. What have I done that makes any difference in the world? You're in the same place. And so that's why I feel like if you keep doing the same thing the same way, you are, whoever said it, Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, whoever, it's the definition of insanity. You expect a very different result, but you continue doing the same thing over and over. And so I think those are some pretty simple formulas that really are driven by the leadership of an individual.
Yeah, I just reflect on a lesson from Cincinnati when we were trying to build the partnership initially, and everybody was doing the same thing of pointing at K-12, pointing at K-12, pointing at K-12. And the chancellor, who was at the time the president of the University of Cincinnati, stood up and said, I just need to say that our retention rate is 48%.
Right.
Our retention rate to freshman to sophomore year is 48%. And I own that, but I need all of you to help me turn it around.
Yeah, that's right.
But that moment of shared vulnerability was critical, getting to your point of humility, to say, we all have our issues, let's not point at one player. That really, I think, gave us gas for about 6 months to get people to begin to build that trust necessary. Yep. Is there anything that you have seen higher ed do? And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, so everybody be gearing up if you've got specific questions that you'd like to ask. Is there anything specific that you've seen higher ed do phenomenally well? A situation where you've said, wow, that really changed it. An example, yesterday, it turns out at the University of Albany, they are creating an incentive so that you can, I don't actually know the terminology, but get credit or get points or get increase your likelihood of getting tenure if you actually work to impact a community level outcome as opposed to just doing research or attracting grants, right? So they're actually creating an incentive towards tenure for doing this kind of work. That's a pretty darn powerful thing, right? It's an institutional policy maybe as opposed to like a state level policy.
Right.
Are there any other things that you've seen higher ed do that have really, you think, contributed to this kind of impact at scale? Is there anything that you've seen?
Well, I have. I think, some of the best in class players that I've observed, one are thinking about the relationship between 2-year and 4-year institutions. And there are all the debates about credit transfer, et cetera, and that will go forward. But there are also other institutions, or not.
The debate will go forward.
Right. But there are also other institutions that are saying, okay, who can we partner with? What 2-year institution can I as a 4-year partner with, and vice versa, so we understand the students, We understand their experience, their competency when they finish that program, and it makes it easier for them to transfer to a four-year institution and go on to get that four-year degree if that's what the student is seeking. So I've seen examples of that. I've also seen examples of two-year institutions, one that are thinking quite significantly about the communities and the places that they sit, the economic circumstances of those schools. Walla Walla Community College is an example of that, that are thinking about that. And Steve Van Osdell years ago said, you know what, our economy is for crap. And I've got students here who are either not finishing or they're not finishing with skills where they can go on and actually get a job and move their lives forward. So let me think about what kind of curriculum we're developing here and what kind of hands-on rich experiences that we can provide for them so that they can be successful, and we can also think about the impact on community.
Yeah.
For them, it was a focus on sustainable energy, and in particular wind. And they built a wind turbine project at the local penitentiary. It's providing energy for that institution, but it's also providing on-the-ground job experience for their students. The vast majority of their students are finishing, and the vast majority of those students are going on to get good jobs. They're also doing this in food and wine, so I'm quite interested in surveying that up close and personal. But
There will always be a need for people to drink wine.
well,
I'm quite sure.
and in Washington State, it's a booming industry.
Totally,
Great.
totally.
So, I see those things happening. And also, when students come in, and particularly when you've got students who, for the first time, they're first generation.
Yep.
And so this is a brand new experience.
Yeah.
And thinking about how do we keep those students on track?
Yep.
So they are actually moving forward, they're taking courses, they're moving through a program that they will actually be able to persist and complete.
So yesterday we had a person up on the panel who had a small little job of running Medicare, which, I mean, I can't imagine what he does every day. He must be bored.
Yeah, it's bored silly.
But he talked about this idea of, in healthcare, patient-centered care. And is there a shift that's needed in education to more student-centered care, where you're thinking more about that? It sounds in a way like that's what this is all about. It's figuring out the ways students could most benefit from their education and meeting them where they are.
It's absolutely, and that happens there are a number of different facets to that. I mean, there's some ways that are very pragmatic, and there are also, one young woman I was speaking to yesterday, and she is one of many, but she described her experience, family, living, things going well, for many reasons, everything completely crumbled. She was given a full-year ride to a very elite college, got there, this is going to be great, and the pressures when she got there were just significant. And a lot of it she's described as being from her peers. And what she described, and what I hear from other young people who are going into these environments for the first time, is there are, in addition to the academic supports, because she was like, I could rock it on the academic side,
right.
but what I was confronting every day, issues of race, issues of socioeconomic status, all of those things were just killing me.
Yep.
And the supports that she needed in that environment, and she found through Posse, the Posse Foundation, but those kinds of supports were integral to her persisting and completing, and also doing well academically.
Yeah. Any insights on that? And then we'll open
so
it up.
I was initially, when you asked that, it's like, let's see, is there any university other than one that was once run or is run by Nancy Zimpher? And I was struggling with that for a little while, but I think that there are a couple things. I mean, I think that this idea, what's exciting to see over the last couple of years is a focus in some higher educational institutions on how do we retain and ensure that not just that they get access, but actually achieve.
Yep.
And the use of some really interesting use of data analytics and predictive analytics to figure out, okay, we now know what problems these kids have. She's not an outlier.
No.
And we know, and we can actually look back and say what her experience has been and what we need to do to intervene. And there's some very exciting things that are happening along those lines. That there's a lot of universities that are innovating on that, but it's not necessarily rolling up to a movement. I think the other thing is on the economic side, it's a little bit of an outlier, but we do a lot of work with universities and hospitals because unfortunately, in America today, those are the biggest economic drivers of most American cities. That, because of the globalization, and so the mindset of a university saying, "Well, I am about educating so many kids, so many years, and having a research budget of X," is saying, "Actually, I'm a $2 billion company. I'm the third largest company in the region, and how do I use my employment, my employees? How I hire." How do I use, which we've seen great success on people out of prison, some of the best employees. Hopkins has great history with this. Their happiest employees and their highest performing are the ones who are actually coming out of prison. But also on the supply chain, right? You spend hundreds of millions of dollars on all kinds of stuff and ensuring that kind of recycles. We do know the old Shtetl economics from my background. It's like we do know that $1 that recycles 5-6 times in the community is what economic development is all about, and there's a power there. It's not the core business of the institution. And I'd say the last thing is those. The key is to, and that's why I think the tables like the Strive and others are so powerful, because you have to think upstream, because basically you're remediating. If you don't insert yourself upstream, you're always remediating. And so yes, we have to remediate because upstream is broken, but how are we going to try to insert ourselves upstream, not as the leader, but as a leader at the table, so you can spend less time and money on the remediation in the future.
Yeah, and as Nancy, but also Dan Heath yesterday morning reminded us that universities, especially colleges of education, have a big role upstream because they're preparing the teachers that are working with children as early as preschool. Right. So there is a clear role there.
And can I just add to your point about universities thinking about themselves differently? Again, also at the convening I just attended, Tulane University, perfect example. And Scott Cowan, who was the former president, was on the White House Council for Community Solutions as well. And they participate on one of our panels. The largest employer, and I didn't realize this, I think the largest employer in New Orleans is Tulane University. They sit at one of these collective impact tables for our collaborative in New Orleans and think about themselves in just that way. So we're not only an educator, but we're also an employer, and the kind of training and support that they are providing opportunity youth in that city is integral to building out the pathways in that city. So it is that dual focus.
Yeah, and the last thing is, like, I think the more you think of this as an ecosystem, so for example, that's a great example in Tulane. So the problem that we've seen with these universities and hospitals is that everybody says, yeah, you should be an employer, you should be this, figure it out. And it's actually, you can't figure it out yourself. There's a whole $1 million infrastructure out there that's working on workforce, that's working on transit issues and all that. And basically you can say, we're happy to play that role, but what are all those people going to bring to the table to allow us to succeed? Because we can't be a transportation company, we can't be a work, all these things, there's actually infrastructure. Realign it. If you're willing to make the commitment to hire 400 people a month, that some of these institutions have so many entry-level jobs, it's crazy a month, then the rest of the region has to align themselves towards you, not the other way around.
Yeah, Starbucks is a great example.
I keep coming back to this, the example you gave, I think from Minneapolis, St. Paul, of them sitting around a table, but not just saying, what are we going to collectively do? Asking themselves individually, what are they going to do or bring to the table to contribute to that outcome? It feels like that has just...
And it's not money. That's the whole thing. I mean, it's like money actually distorts. Money distorts.
Say more about that.
So when people get a big grant, all it does is everybody then races to do whatever the grant asks you to do. Oftentimes what the grant wants you to do is what the funder wanted you, not what you need to do, right? So first of all, it's all screwed up. And then it ends, right? And then it ends. And so then you go back to doing what you thought you should have been doing or whatever it is. And so instead of saying, what's the outcome we want? And what do we have to do to get there, and how much can we actually do? And the mayor of Buffalo was on this panel that I was doing yesterday, and his quote was so amazing. He said, the magic of this, after 3 years about college achievement, the magic of this was, what we realized is we had all the power to do this ourselves without anybody's additional money or anybody from the outside telling us what to do. And that's what it is. It's like you actually have all of the tools to fix the problem. And you might need some money to, help you try stuff and do. I'm not saying money doesn't matter.
And it gets back to what Melanie was saying of having the investors potentially be partners in developing the solution, right? You said that's that mind shift of we're not just writing checks, we're engaged with you.
I mean, grants, all of Bill Gates' money is a day and a half of the federal spend, right? Grant money is not going to solve our problems.
Yeah.
It will help us try stuff and maybe experiment or fund a backbone for a little while till you see it works. But the bottom line is, unless we redirect the billions that we're currently spending without the results we want, we're never going to solve the problem. That to me is going to be the Achilles heel of this entire movement.
All right.
The entire movement, because that's what success has to be.
We can say definitively across the 53 members of our network that in any case where a grant of over $2, $3, $4 million has been put on the table to get the work started, that has slowed the work down rather than sped it up, because the focus became on the grant money rather than the outcome. So, questions. I was told that this was a bad idea because people may give long speeches in their questions. So prove me right by asking a very quick and concise question. We have people running down the aisle here. Here's a question right here. There we go. Coming.
Have you been on Oprah? Because this is kind of the closest I'm going to get, I think, to like Oprah. You haven't been on Oprah.
No.
Yeah, we're working on this, though. She definitely needs to be on Oprah. All right, let's go.
So Ben, you said that in academia, the problem is that everyone has the best ideas.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. But I also think it's that people think that they have the best framework theoretically for their ideas. And so no one else's ideas from outside that framework can be right.
Right.
So what do you do to break down kind of that ideological entrenchment when you have two partners who are really key, but they just refuse to hear what each other have to say on ideological?
Yeah, that's when you move. You go to a different... I do think it's hard because basically that's where the humility comes in. You have to basically say, maybe I don't have the answer, and if I did, why is nobody else doing what I thought was so brilliant? And one of my favorite terms is suspend disbelief. I've sat for years, and all the work I've always done, I say, let's just suspend disbelief and try this for a little while. That's why I love this build, measure, learn. Let's try this for a little while. If we really don't think it's going to work, then we'll try your thing. But the other part of it is everybody else thinks it's a good idea, then let's try their idea. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be right. Be a partner, be a player, and then you hope it succeeds, and if it doesn't, then help to adapt it to something else.
Mm-hmm. Any insights on that one?
Well, I would just also add, I think that's when the spade work on the front end makes sense, because ultimately, and I saw this a lot in Congress, and I worked for Kennedy. He had a very strong opinions about things, but he was also able to get a lot of things done, and recognizing, okay, we've got a similar goal, and I've got a way to get there, and you've got a way to get there, so let's back up from that and recognize that we're going to have to negotiate our way through this, but understanding and respecting the fact that we ultimately want the same thing. Yep. And that's why I think that community work on the front end and listening, and it isn't interminable, like we're going to do 10 years of listening. That will happen over the course of the work, but doing that work on the front end makes a very big difference.
And Becky Margiotta, who was here yesterday, she brought up this powerful point of not everybody's going to come along.
No.
And if you have people that are entrenched that will not see the value of the whole, that sometimes they just have to be left behind until they're ready. I don't know.
Or they shift off. I mean, one of the communities that we looked at when we did the work at the White House was work. I don't know if there's anyone here from or grew up in Milwaukee, but Milwaukee was trying to focus on ending poverty. Which, that's a lot to wrap your arms around. But literally, as they were building a collaborative and doing this work, people opened the paper one day and literally opened the paper and saw, we've got one of the highest teen pregnancy rates in the country. I mean, horrible numbers. And they said, okay, let's back off or let's recognize this as a subset of our big goal and start to focus on that. But in doing that, and the way that people started to come together and take on teen pregnancy, Some people said, I don't like that. I'm not comfortable with it. I'm not comfortable with the approach and, contraception and sex education and the messaging. So some people left that collaborative. Others joined that collaborative. If you read within the last 6 months or so, they have done phenomenal work. They have brought down those numbers in a significant way. But that required okay, we've got similar goals, but we're not all comfortable with the new way we're going to approach it. Some people backing off, others coming to the table, success coming out of that, and now others are coming to the table because they're saying, okay, well, let's take on third grade reading now, because they've also developed that muscle. So that does happen along the
Is
way.
a great story.
Over in the middle.
Hi, Melody, you spoke earlier about foster care youth and aging out of the foster care system. Can you talk a little bit more about resources for youth who age out of that system?
Well, resources that exist or, sorry.
Yes, resources that exist. You started talking about that just a little bit.
Oh, sure. I was talking about the example in Maine, because what we see, and we see this a lot as we deal with opportunity youth, that once they hit 18, once they hit a point where they're considered to be emancipated and they are falling out of the system, things that may have, in some cases things are going well, or some cases things are leveling off, they go down. It's like a swan dive into the pool, because many of the supports that surrounded them start to fall away. Some of the communities in our collective impact Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund work has specifically started to focus on that. So Maine is one. I feel like Los Angeles may be another one, where they, again, not boiling the ocean, but saying, if we can start to figure out the connective dots to the foster care system, let's just start there, then we can start to address a significant problem with a big subset of our opportunity youth population. So looking at job training and education as part of it. What I know outside of this work, but deeply connected to it, also looking at issues of healthcare. And the healthcare resources that are available to foster care youth, again, as they start to age out of the population. For specific access to information, I think there's both statewide, and then there's also what's happening federally. When I was at the White House, we also started to look at these issues in the context of healthcare. And I'm happy to touch base with you afterward to try and connect you
And
with
Annie
some
Casey
specific
Foundation
things.
also does a huge amount of work on that.
Yeah, we're seeing in a lot of communities that it's hiring transition coordinators. So when there's this moment of drop-off like that sometimes it's a matter of simply getting people to the resources that may already exist but are completely right now siloed. It's a very interesting
it's
approach
hard,
that we're seeing.
really hard.
We've got one more question that I'm going to ask each of you after this question for a final deep thought.
Okay.
That if, given that all of these folks are
Who gets
now...
to judge the depth?
What?
Who's judging the depth?
The depth, that will be Nancy.
All right.
She will pick a winner. But the question is, all these folks are going to be fired up now to do collective impact work.
Yeah.
The question would be, what is one insight? Deep thought on if you were in their shoes, what would you want them to do? But one more question over here.
Yes, you mentioned a shift in philanthropy, and I just want to, there's a report from the New America Foundation this month called Undermining Pell, How Colleges' Pursuit of Prestige and Revenue is Hurting Low-Income Students. And so what it addresses is that the colleges with the fewest resources tend to serve the largest share of low-income students. And the colleges with the large endowments don't serve low-income students. And they also don't have any experience in serving low-income students. So how can you address this in the collective impact?
I mean, that's a significant issue for the reasons that you've raised the issue. I think, one, we're looking at ways that we can, and this goes to something that Ben was talking about, there are a lot of different federal funding streams that sit out there and a lot of different resources that are sitting out there but siloed. Are there ways that we can start to realign some of those resources to be helpful? To what kinds of incentives, and some of these are policy-related changes, what kinds of incentives, and this is a big debate, as you all know, in higher education, to ensure that as institutions are looking at their measure of success, another big controversial issue, that there isn't the creaming off so that Pell eligible students start to get dropped off because they're considered to be a difficult population to support and to see persist through the process. I think also, I know from our experience at NYU, which has a very, very tiny endowment, particularly given where it sits among its peers, looking for other kinds of resources, which is the way that John Sexton is taking this on, to try and build up the financial support that would allow for more low-income students to be able to come to the university, and a university that has a tuition that my parents would have, run screaming from the room had they seen when I was going to college. So I think it's a mixture of policy. I think it's an issue of, how do we braid or blend federal funding streams to be supportive of those students? How do we continue to protect Pell, which consistently remains, threatened? And also, how do we support institutions of higher education that, as they're looking for ways, as you all are looking for ways to try and build your base of financial support for those students. And the last thing I'll say is also helping the country, for the reasons that Ben mentioned, as a baseline, understand why this is so critically important. That we are flipping ourselves upside down in terms of the populations that are fastest growing being the least educated, and unless this becomes a national priority, then we're all toast.
Yeah, and can I just touch
Real
on
quick,
that?
because we're out of time.
Yeah, but I think this is my deep thought. I'll use it on this.
Okay,
but,
this will be your closing deep thought.
Yeah, because I actually think that's the defining moment, the defining issue of our time. And I think the answer is somewhat it's to his question, which is I actually think that's something that people like those in this room, you have to come together. It's not about just the institutions here. It's like every major public institution is how we're going to solve this. We're not going to solve it with the Ivy Leagues, right? I think the Ivy Leagues graduate 15,000 a year or something. Who cares? Right? Honestly, that is not going to solve our problem, and they're not going to all of a sudden go from 15,000 to 1.5 million.
Yeah.
Right? The 1.5 million is going to come from this room.
Yeah.
And so I think talk about collectively, you got to get together and you got to say this is the new way this has to work. Across jurisdictions, and say these are the supports we have to say. This is how we're going to use data. But this is a a huge national problem. And the urgency of it is the part that everywhere I go, it's like there's an urgency of now to this, and it's going to take everyone working in a very different way.
Yeah, and it's there could be a financial incentive if we get the right policies in place, right? Too.
Yeah.
But it is a moral imperative.
Yeah, and if there's a big idea, I guarantee money will follow.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any last deep thought? Melody, it's wonderful that you came in. I know you've got to rush out too, so just thank you so much for being here. But any last deep thought?
This is collective impact it's a new muscle to be exercised. It is a new way of doing business, and that requires, I think, urgent patience, which means it's true. I mean, we have to move aggressively, but we also have to understand that it is going to take time. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fail, but we can move forward.
That is wonderful. Will you please join me in thanking Ben and Melody?